Since its discovery in 1853, the ancient city-state of Ur, located in southern Mesopotamia, has been identified as the ancient hometown of Abraham. In scripture, we are told that his father Terah was from Ur of the Chaldees, which in Hebrew is Ur-Kasdim. Due to the Chaldeans early on in the first millennium BC, this term has been overlooked as a scribal gloss, essentially specifying to a later audience which region this term was speaking of. This has led to an unawareness that in the original Hebrew scriptures, this location was written as Ur-Kasdim. So today, we are going to see why the identification of Ur in Samaria as Ur of Chaldees is problematic, and how a far more likely location in the north of Mesopotamia is far more plausible. This location is Urkesh, which was inhabited by an ancient Aryan elite who ruled over the region. These people were called the Mitanni, and today we will go over the clues that indicate Abraham's relation to them. Through this, we will also see how the Mitanni, Aryans, and Arameans ultimately corroborate my assertion that Abraham was of the RY-DNA haplotype, with his son Ishmael representing R1a, Isaac representing R1b, and Keturah's sons representing R2. Now, a quick disclaimer before we get into the content. Since the true name of Abraham's home is Ur-Kasdim and not Ur of Chaldeans, I will be referring to it by this name for the rest of this video. Now to start, I want to list off criteria throughout the Bible that narrow down the location of Ur-Kasdim and show that it could not have been Ur in Samaria. Criteria include: Ur-Kasdim has to be located past Haran. Ur-Kasdim has to be within the same region as Haran. Ur-Kasdim has to be beyond and across the river Euphrates. Ur-Kasdim has to fall within the land of the Arameans between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And Ur-Kasdim has to be located in or near the plain of Olishem. So how can we know that Ur in Samaria does not match these points of criteria? Let's start off with criteria number 1. Ur-Kasdim has to be located past Haran. In Genesis 11 verse 31, we are told that Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldees to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. A 2018 article by Derek Gilbert states, "Just looking at the story logically, Haran was much too far north and east for Abraham's father Terah to make it a stop on the way to Canaan if he'd been traveling from Ur in Samaria. There were much shorter routes between Sumer and Canaan. For example, a caravan route that linked the Mari on the Euphrates to Damascus via Palmyra. In other words, Mesopotamians in the 21st century BC would have mocked anyone from Ur in Sumer who tried to get to Canaan by way of Haran. Ending up in Haran would have required missing one turn completely and then taking another turn in the wrong direction away from Canaan." End quote. So, in the case of Ur of Samaria, it makes zero sense as to how Terah and his family ended up in Haran, and therefore, Ur in Samaria does not fulfill the first piece of criteria. Now, criteria number 2. In Genesis 12 verse 1, the Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household, to the land I will show you." At this point, Abraham and his family had already settled in Haran. So if Haran is considered to be part of his country, that means his hometown Ur-Kasdim is within that same region. Obviously, we know that Haran is a town in the Sanliurfa province in southeastern Turkey. This is 1,100 kilometers away from Ur in Samaria, and there were multiple tribes and city-states between the two locations. So Ur is definitely not in the same country as Haran. Criteria number 3. In Joshua 24 verses 2-3, Joshua said to all the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham, from the land beyond the Euphrates and led him through Canaan and gave him many descendants. So, is Ur of Samaria beyond the Euphrates? The answer is no. It is actually situated west of the river Euphrates in the south, on the same side as Canaan. Furthermore, to get to the Euphrates, Israelites would have journeyed northwards from Canaan. To them, beyond the Euphrates would mean beyond the region in which they arrive at the Euphrates. So when it speaks about Abraham coming from beyond the Euphrates, it is not speaking about any region beyond the Euphrates, but rather the region immediately beyond the point at which they arrived to the Euphrates, which is in the north. For example, I am from Toronto, and the quickest way to get to America would be to go through Niagara. So for me, beyond the border would be Buffalo. But for somebody living in Vancouver, beyond the border would be Washington. So for the Israelites, beyond the Euphrates referred to northern Mesopotamia. Originally, Ur and Samaria laid along the shore of the Persian Gulf, all the way in the south, and on the western side of the Euphrates. So in no way is Ur of Samaria beyond the Euphrates in the perspective of ancient Israelites. Now, criteria number 4 actually ties into number 3. See, in Genesis 24 verse 3-4, Abraham tells his servant, "I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I am living, but will go to my country and my own relatives and get a wife for my son Isaac." Then in Genesis 24 verse 10, the servant leaves, taking with him 10 of his master's camels loaded with all kinds of good things from his master. He set out for Aram Naharaim and made his way to the town of Nahor. So, Isaac's wife needs to be from Abraham's home and tribe. But to find her, Abraham's servant set out for Aram Naharaim, specifically the town of Nahor. Well, Aram Naharaim means Aram between the rivers, these rivers being the Tigris and Euphrates. Both the Septuagint and Flavius Josephus translate the name as Mesopotamia, and later on, ancient writers would use the name Mesopotamia for all the land between these two rivers. However, the usage of the Hebrew name Aram Naharaim does not match this later usage of Mesopotamia, since the Hebrew term was referring to a northern region within Mesopotamia. And so, if the area of Aram Naharaim is in the northern plain of Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, Ur-Kasdim cannot possibly be located in Sumeria. Ur in Samaria was neither beyond the Euphrates and within the Tigris, or in the north where the Arameans dwelled. Lastly, criteria number 5. The opening chapter of the Book of Abraham mentions a location named the Plain of Olishem. It isn't clear from the text whether the plain itself was Olishem, or whether some city or region in the area to which the plain was adjacent was Olishem, or if the plain takes its name from a major city on the plain. In any case, this plain of Olishem was near Abraham's homeland of Ur-Kasdim according to the Book of Abraham. Scholars now believe that the location of Olishem mentioned by Abraham is the ancient place name Ulishum. This speculation is based on inscriptional evidence dating to the time of the Akkadian king Naram-Sin, who reigned from 2254 to 2218 BC. This inscription spoke of Ulishum in what is now northern Syria or southern Turkey. The inscription of Naram-Sin reads, "Then, from the mouth of the Euphrates, he smote the river, as far as Ulishum." Scholars have debated the proposal that Olishem is Ulishum, and at least half a dozen sites have been proposed over the years. Nonetheless, they all agree that the general location of Olishem is in the southern Turkey or northern Syria region. Naram-Sin's inscription would corroborate this. Of course, the Akkadians conquered and ruled over Sumeria, so when Naram-Sin says that he smote the mouth of the river Euphrates as far as Ulishum, he is saying that Ulishum is near the end of the Euphrates, whereas Ur is at the mouth of the Euphrates. This would have made even more sense in the time of Naram Sin, since decreasing sea level has caused for the Persian Gulf to recede. Nonetheless, Ur was originally situated on the shore of the Persian Gulf, and was therefore located at its mouth. Of course, if Naram Sin is smiting the mouth of the river, this means that he was located at the mouth of the river. What we can conclude from this is that there is no way Ur in Sumeria is located in or near the plain of Oli Shem, since they are mentioned as being on opposite ends of the river. So this is yet another point of criteria that Ur in Sumeria does not fulfill. But what if I told you that there was a location that does fulfill all the criteria I've brought up? This is Urkesh, which was situated in the foothills of the Taurus Mountains in northeastern Syria. Before we get to how this location fulfills the points I previously went over, I want to briefly go over the etymology of the name Urkesh. See, what we know as Ur of the Chaldees was originally written as Ur-Kasdim. In Paleo-Hebrew, there were no vowels or accents attached to letters in order to indicate how the words were pronounced. Whereas the Hebrew letter Shin may be pronounced as S today, it originally made a Sh sound, whereas another letter, the Samek, made a S sound. The term Kasdim does not contain the letter Samek, but rather Shin. Therefore, the original pronunciation of Ur-Kasdim would have been Ur-Kashdim. Now, the dim part at the end of Kashdim may refer to them as being a people, similarly to how some tribes have Ait at the end of their name. Therefore, it's possible that the people of Urkesh would be referred to as Urkeshites or Urkashdim, and this is extremely similar to Ur-Kashdim. Now, you may be wondering, doesn't Kashdim refer to the Chaldeans who lived in Babylon? And the answer is no. This is problematic for multiple reasons. For one, during the time of Abraham, the Chaldeans had not yet taken over Sumeria. Chaldea existed between the early 9th and mid-6th centuries BC, which is even after Moses, who supposedly wrote Genesis. Nabopolassar was actually the first king of the Chaldean Empire, and he hadn't taken Ur from control of the Assyrians until 626 BC. This is far after the book of Genesis was written. And to add, Ur has never been called Ur of the Chaldeans in any historical document whatsoever. So it makes no sense for Ur in Sumeria to be called Ur of the Chaldeans in reference to Abraham. Even further, Genesis 10 verse 10 explains that Uruk, which is 50 miles from Ur, is in the land of Shinar. Therefore, the region around Ur in Sumeria was called Shinar. And if Abraham had been from Ur in Sumeria, a far better name for his hometown would have been Ur-Shinar, or Ur of Shinar. So this all begs the question, if Abraham's hometown is actually Urkesh, why has the term Chaldees been swapped with Kashdim? Well, there are numerous explanations. One, it could be a scribal gloss or an error. A later scribe may have seen the term Kasdim, and in order to apply a location to it, they switched Kasdim to Chaldeans, thinking that Abraham's Ur was the same one they knew of on the western side of the Euphrates. In actuality, it may be that the name of Abraham's hometown was Ur-Kashdim rather than Ur of Kashdim, rendering the Chaldean part as completely irrelevant to the equation. In my opinion, this is the most likely scenario. However, let's entertain the possibility that Chaldeans is a proper translation for Kashdim. Considering the Chaldeans were not present in Ur until over a millennium after Abraham was alive, Kashdim may be referring to a location in which the Chaldeans originally came from, rather than where they end up. This would allow for Abraham's Ur to be differentiated from the primary Ur, which was located near the Persian Gulf. Think about it like this. I am from Toronto, Ontario. Most people in North America, and even parts of Europe, know exactly where that is. but think of a guy from Toronto, Texas. If he were to travel around the world and tell people he's from Toronto, they may think he is speaking of the most famous Toronto, which is in Canada. So he would have to add, no, Toronto of Texas. So the Hebrews may have been identifying the Ur that Abraham was from by saying that it was Ur of the Chaldees, not Ur of the Sumerians in the land of Shinar. And so, where did the Chaldeans originally come from? Well, the Chaldeans were a Semitic tribe, possibly descendants of the Amorites who founded the Neo-Babylonian Empire in the first millennium BC. That's the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar, not the Babylon of Hammurabi, who lived about 1,200 years earlier. But the Greek historian Xenophon, who wrote in the 4th century BC, referred to another group of Chaldeans. They were a warlike people who were neighbors of the Armenians. They lived north of Urfa and Haran, between Mesopotamia and modern Armenia. In another book, Xenophon linked the Chaldeans to the Carduchians, who were probably the ancestors of the modern Kurds. The assertion that Chaldeans originally come from the region surrounding Haran is further backed by the deities worshipped by the people in that region. See, Urartu was the original Aramean kingdom, and their first monarch was even named Aram. Urartian, Vanic, and Chaldean are conventional names for the language spoken by the inhabitants of the ancient kingdom of Urartu, which was located in the region of Lake Van. Chaldi was one of the 3 chief deities of Ararat. The other 2 chief deities were Thispas of Kumenu and Shivini of Tushpa. Of all the gods in the Urartian pantheon, most inscriptions are dedicated to Chaldi. His wife was the goddess Arubani, an Urartian goddess of fertility and art. Chaldi was a warrior god whom the kings of Urartu would pray to for victories in battle. His shrine was at Ardini in Mushashir. Inscriptions show that the Urartians and Hurrians had at least 79 different gods, and this conglomeration of gods were called Chaldees. In the inscription of Argistis near Van, it states, "This is the spoil of the cities which I obtained for the people of the Chaldees in 1 year. To Chaldees, the giver, to the Chaldees, the children of Chaldees the mighty." Later on in time, the people who worshipped these gods ended up dwelling in the northern area of Anatolia known as Chaldea, near the shores of the Black Sea. Ultimately, Ur of Chaldees may not be referring to the Chaldeans who took over Sumeria a millennium later after Abraham, but rather people in the land of Aram who worship deities referred to as Chaldees, and refer to their culture as Chaldean. It seems the later Chaldeans actually stem from this root source. So, whether Chaldees is a mistranslation from Kashdim, or Chaldees actually refers to the Chaldees in the Ararat region, the land of Abraham is still not located in Sumeria. Rather, it was in the north of Mesopotamia, and Ur-Kashdim would fall within the region of Urartu and the Arameans. Now, if the term Kashdim or Chaldeans is referring to people within the Ararat region, this explains why in Deuteronomy 26 verse 5, we are told, "My father was a wandering Aramean." See, the Urartians in Ararat actually branched from Aram. Therefore, Abraham would have dwelled amongst the Arameans. And this is where Urkesh becomes relevant again. Not only did a large contingent of Arameans dwell in Urkesh, but it matches the exact geographical criteria that we went over earlier. Criteria 1 is that Ur-Kashdim has to be past Haran in the northeast. Urkesh is a location that perfectly explains how Terah and Abraham ended up in Haran. This is because Urkesh is 230 kilometers east of Haran. So along the route from Urkesh to Canaan, they certainly would have passed Haran. Considering the 230 kilometers already traveled, it's understandable as to why they would have called it quits upon reaching Haran. In contrast, if they had been coming from a place such as Urfa in Turkey, it wouldn't make sense for them to stop and settle in Haran since it's only 48 kilometers away. Now, you may be thinking, this doesn't work because Abraham and Terah would have taken the quickest possible route to Canaan, and therefore would have traveled down the Kabur River right beside Urkesh to get to the Euphrates and then cross it. My response is, Abraham and Terah would have had an entire caravan with herds of animals, so they would have taken as much of a land route as possible. They wouldn't have traveled down the Kabur River to get to the Euphrates and then sailed back upwards to Haran. Instead, they traveled directly to Haran from Urkesh via the land. All that work may have been a contributing factor as to why they called it quits and ended their journey in Haran. But why Haran? Why did they travel westwards around the Kabur rather than eastwards around it and down towards the Euphrates? For one, trade routes. To the east of the Kabur River, there was a lack of outposts and cities that they could stop in, resupply, or trade at, whereas Haran itself was a merchant outpost. So they may have thought, we will get around the Kabur River by traveling west and then briefly stop in Haran to get rest and trade. The second reason is that east and south of the Kabur, Hurrian dominance began to wane. So if they went east around the Kabur River, they'd risk coming close to enemy territory, whereas going west would have them entering familiar territory dominated by the Hurrians, particularly Haran, as it was predominantly Hurrian and would have been much easier for Abraham and Terah to conduct business in. Criteria number 2 is that Ur-Kasdim has to be part of the same country or civilization as Haran. Well, Urkesh is within the same region as Haran. They are 230 kilometers apart from one another. Though that seems like a massive distance, this entire region belonged to the exact same ethnic and cultural demographic. They were called the Hurrians, and we will get to them in a bit to show how they are extremely significant in regards to this topic, thus providing more evidence that Abraham was Indo-European. But for now, understand that Urkesh is in the same country and region as Haran, while Ur in Sumeria is not. So on to criteria number 3. This is that Ur-Kasdim and Canaan have to be on opposite sides of the Euphrates River, a criteria that Urkesh fits perfectly, being that it is east of the Euphrates while Canaan is west of it. Criteria number 4 is that Ur-Kasdim needs to fall within the land of Arameans in Aram Naharaim. Again, Aram Naharaim means Aram between the two rivers, which is exactly where Urkesh is situated. Matter of fact, much of the demographic within Urkesh was Aramean, and their presence wasn't condensed to Urkesh alone, but rather permeated throughout all of Hurrian society. The fact that Abraham's home has to be in Aram Naharaim is exactly why Josephus, Maimonides, and other early Jewish sages claim that Abraham's birthplace was in northern Mesopotamia, right where we find Urkesh. Remember, Mesopotamia by definition is the land between the Tigris and Euphrates. So, if Abraham is from Urkesh, it makes sense as to why in Acts 7 verse 2, St. Stephen says, "Brothers and fathers, listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham while he was still in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran." Again, Ur of Samaria is not within Mesopotamia. It is west of the Euphrates River and did not have a Chaldean presence until roughly a millennium after Abraham's life. Now lastly, criteria number 5 is that Ur-Kasdim has to be located in or near a plain in northern Syria or eastern Turkey, and located along or near the Euphrates River towards its end. Well, that's exactly where Urkesh is. Not only is it at the end of the Euphrates opposite from the Persian Gulf, but it is located in a relatively flat plain. So evidently, Urkesh in the north fulfills the 5 criteria that Ur in Sumeria does not. It is past Haran and in a lineal path towards Canaan. It is across and beyond the Euphrates River. It is in Aram Naharaim, the northern portion of Mesopotamia, and it is within the vicinity of Olishem. But here's one more clue that Urkesh is the right location. Urkesh is in the foothills of the Taurus Mountains. The age of Taurus ran from 4300 BC to 2150 BC. There are many opposing viewpoints as to when Abraham was born, but they all fall within the late 3rd millennium to the early 2nd millennium BC. This would ultimately be towards the end of the age of Taurus. The next age after Taurus was Aries, and it was represented by a ram. Well, in the land of Canaan, Abraham was tested by the Lord and tasked with sacrificing his son Isaac. Obviously, the Lord did not allow him to go through with it, as it was a test of loyalty and obedience. After all, the Lord had incredible plans in store for Isaac, so he surely would not want him dead. Now, after seeing that Abraham would obey and follow his commands, even to the point of sacrificing his beloved son, God had him sacrifice a ram instead. Essentially, the ram represents Abraham's establishment in Canaan. So, Abraham leaving Urkesh near the Taurus Mountains and going to Canaan where he would sacrifice a ram symbolizes the earth moving out of Taurus and into Aries. The geography matches the celestial signs, matches the narrative. From Urkesh to Canaan is the same as from Taurus to Aries, and Abraham's life falls within the exact time frame of the transition between these ages. We simply cannot make a connection like this with Ur and Samaria. So, now that we see how Urkesh is in perfect alignment to the geographical criteria of Ur-Kasdim, what is another bit of evidence that we are on the right track? Well, there may actually be a historical document speaking of Abraham's father Terah. Here is a brief video from Dr. David A. Falk, explaining how King Teru of Urkesh may be the biblical Terah.
In an online article by Christopher Eames, Eames has made the suggestion that Abraham's father, Terah, can be identified as Teru in the Mari texts. Today, we are going to look at some of those Mari texts to see if that hypothesis holds water. An early letter from Teru to Zimri-Lin, king of Amari, ARM 2844, reads, "Previously my lord informed me via Kalu-Rabi as follows, quote, 'Where are all the good deeds that I have showered on Terah? Why has this person not done the same for me even once?' End quote. As soon as Halu-Rabi told me this, I gathered the information that my lord sent me and sought to do well by my lord. Since I fulfilled this matter, my city was ready to cover me up with stones, that is, kill him. But the God of my lord extracted me from the grip of Elam's viceroy. My lord should know this. My lord must not say anything because I could not visit my lord. The people of Huru are at war with Shadum Labua because of Ishmeadu of Ashnakum. Moreover, in their anger, Ilusumu is being promoted as a political rival for Shadum Labua. I am keeping control of Ashnakum's fortress. As to Shadum Labua, my lord ought to send him out with honor. Once Shadum Labua comes back, I will then come to my lord." Now, this letter is actually one of two very, very similar letters sent by Teru, ARM 2844 and ARM 2844 bis. And they only differ very, very slightly. This letter names the sender as Teru, but the second letter identifies the sender as ruler of Urkesh, and they are sent essentially by the same person. And while later letters get more explicit about this being Terah of Urkesh, we can just tell just from these two letters who is being the sender of this correspondence to Zimri Lim. Now, Urkesh is located in northern Syria, in the eastern portion, at a site called Tel Mozan. Both the kingdoms of Mari and the kingdom of Elam had laid claims to this, but it was sort of on the outskirts, so both of these great kingdoms were fighting over this territory. Terah had an alliance with the king of Mari, Zimri Lim. However, his people seem to have had a much closer cultural affinity towards the Elamites. So what exactly is this good deed that Terah is talking about that he did for Zimri Lim? Well, another Mari letter was sent by Yadurnasi, an agent of the king of Mari, which sort of spells out exactly what Terah did for the king of Mari. And we find this in Mari letter 712, which reads, "A servant of Shadum Labua, brother of Sametar, the king of Ashnakum, a servant of Terah of Urgesh, which is Urkesh, and a servant of Hamikum of Shudukum, have had the head of Ishme Adu of Ashnakum conveyed to Sagaratum. I questioned them, and they told me, quote, the army of Atarum of Andarig came to Ashnakum. Having heard it, Terah and Hamikum killed Ishme Adu and forced the rest of Atarum out." In this letter, we have a person named Terah of Urkesh, the same Terah that we have seen already in the ARM letters. And the deed that he did, the good deed he did for his king, Zimri Lim, was essentially to kill Ishme Adu and then to deliver his cold dead head. Now, the evidence presented by this particular letter is more compelling than we often get in ancient Near Eastern studies to identify a particular person. When one tries to put together a family tree, genealogists will tell you it's often not enough to have a person's name. You also need a place associated with that person. And the reason is because having a name and a place helps to narrow the identity of a person so it's easier to confirm. In this particular letter sent by the agent of Zimri Lim, we have identified in here a Terah of Urkesh. So we have a name and a place. So the similarities here between Terah of Urkesh and Terah of is a very compelling match. Now, when most scholars approach the biblical text regarding Terah and of the Chaldees, most scholars will assume that the of the Chaldees part is a scribal gloss. Now, a scribal gloss is an explanation that has been inserted in a biblical text by a later scribe to try to explain something. And in most cases, the majority of scholars will suggest that Abraham's is actually the of Sumer, the great as it were, the big city of that's located in Sumer. Acts 7, 2-3 states that of Chaldees was located in Mesopotamia. Now, this is actually a bit of a problem for the of Sumer. because by definition, Mesopotamia is actually located between two rivers. It literally means between the two rivers. That's what Mesopotamia means. So Mesopotamia is the land between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. The problem for Ur of Sumer is that Ur of Sumer is actually located south of the Euphrates, outside of Mesopotamia. Furthermore, Joshua 24, 2-3 describes Terah and the ancestors of the Israelites having lived beyond or on the other side of the river. This is also a problem for the Ur of Sumer hypothesis, because Ur of Sumer happens to be on the same side of the Euphrates as Canaan. One does not actually need to cross the river, the great river being either the river Euphrates or the river Tigris, to actually go from Sumer to Canaan. So it's clear that Joshua has a different Ur in mind than the Ur of Sumer. This is where the city of Urkesh is actually a more viable hypothesis. This is because Urkesh is located across the Euphrates in the northern portion of Mesopotamia. Finally, the Mari texts mention that Terah of Ur was not a very popular man. The final letter from Terah of Urkesh comes from ARM 2846 1' to 7', and it reads, I am always praying to my Lord. I have just now left the comfort of my home and have gone out to Shinnach to live as Habiru, that is, a Hapiru. Because of this, my Lord must not be negligent towards me. This letter is interesting because Terah leaves Urkesh and he moves westward towards Shinnach. Now, Shinnach is a mountain in the coastal mountain range in Syria, and Haran was just east of that mountain range. The other interesting thing to note is that Terah is living like a Hapiru. And it's clear here that Hapiru is not being used as an ethnonym, but as a class distinction. Terah is going from being the ruler of Urkesh to being an outcast, a Hapiru. And the context of this letter makes that very, very clear. Now, the other thing that's really, really important about these letters is the fact that Zimri Lim, the king to whom Terah addressed all these letters, his dates are confirmed by synchronisms. So we actually have dates for Zimri Lim. And he dates from 1756 to 1741 BC. This just happens to be during the early reign of Hammurabi. And ultimately, Zimri Lim's reign ends by being overthrown and conquered by Hammurabi. So what we have here is a very, very interesting sort of set of synchronisms. Now, we have already discussed, as I said in a previous video, that Abraham's synchronism ties him to both Hammurabi and the kings of Elam. But now we've got a synchronism for Terah that ties Terah, or Terah, to Zimri Lim, or early in Hammurabi's reign. So what we have here is more than just a synchronism. We now have a rudimentary timeline. The father of Abraham lived early in the reign of Hammurabi and the reign of Zimri Lim, king of Mari. And then after that, we have later on in Hammurabi's reign, Abraham moving to Canaan. So it's a very, very interesting timeline here that's coming out as a result of these synchronisms.
If King Terah of Urkesh is actually Terah, father of Abraham, then Genesis 23 verse 6 makes complete sense. See, when Sarah passed away, Abraham made an inquiry to the Hittites about obtaining a gravesite to bury her in. The Hittites replied, "Hear us, my lord, thou art a mighty prince amongst us. In the choice of our sepulchres, bury thy dead. None of us shall withhold from thee his sepulchre." Now, the Hittites and Hurrians were heavily intermixed, and it's likely that a large portion of the Hurrians originally descended from the Hittites. There is also significant amounts of Hurrian influence within Hittite mythology. Therefore, if Abraham was the son of Terah, who was a powerful king amongst the Hurrians with a domain that stretched well into Hittite territory, Abraham would have been a prince to the Hittites. People will likely rebut this by saying Abraham is referred to as a mighty prince amongst them because Sarah was a Hittite, and her original name was Sarai, which meant princess. Essentially, she was likely part of a royal Hittite dynasty, and therefore, when Abraham wed her, he became a Hittite prince. However, this does not debunk that Abraham was a Hurrian prince from Urkesh, because as we know, royalty did not intermarry with nomadic peasants. The Hittite royalty would only seek marriages that strategically benefited them and kept power and prestige within the bloodline. So Abraham was a Hurrian prince who married a Hittite princess, therefore becoming a mighty prince amongst the Hittites. Now, people may also claim that a plausible interpretation as to why he is called a mighty prince is that the Hittites foresaw his dynasty expanding and becoming prominent in the region. However, if this is the case, they'd be calling him a king. In my opinion, they call him a prince because they're familiar with who he is and where he comes from. They would have known about his father King Terah, who ruled over the Hurrians and many Hittites alike. So Abraham was not exactly a king to them, but rather a prince. Now, if Abraham was a prince and his father Terah was a king, it also makes sense as to why his grandfather Nahor had his own city. As we went over earlier, Genesis 24 tells of how Isaac got his wife. In verses 3 to 4 and 10, Abraham tells his servant, "I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, but will go to my country and mine own relatives and get a wife for my son Isaac." Then the servant left, taking with him 10 of his master's camels loaded with all kinds of good things. He set out for Aram Naharaim and made his way to the town of Nahor. So, Isaac's wife needed to be from Abraham's home and tribe, and to find her, his servant set out for Aram Naharaim, specifically the town of Nahor. We already established that Aram Naharaim means Aram between the rivers, and that Urkesh falls within this region. So where is the town of Nahor, which Isaac's wife is said to come from? Well, let's refer back to the Amorite Lim dynasty and the Mari Empire that they ruled over, because an article from the Jewish Virtual Library reads, "The cities of Haran and Nahor in the Upper Balig Valley are well documented as important dependencies controlled by the governors from Mari. Both cities were foci of tribal foment. At the Temple of Sin in Haram, a treaty between the kings of Zalmakum and the Yamanites was sworn against the Mari, while at Nahor, reinforcements had often been called in to quell local uprisings inflamed by the Habiru. Now, a quick interjection, Habiru are the same people King Terah said he was going to live like after leaving Urkesh and going to the region of Haran." And with that, back to the article. Alongside the West Semitic peoples in this region was a considerable Hurrian element, and it may well have left an imprint upon the initial ethnic and cultural composition of the Hebrews. The picture revealed in the Amorite archives of far-reaching tribal migrations, such as those of the Yemenite groups and caravan conditions between the Euphrates region and Syria northern Palestine, provides an analogy for the biblical narratives of the patriarchal wanderings between Aram Naharaim and Canaan. Now, when I heard that Nahor is said to be in the Balig Valley, this made me question whether Urfa in Turkey actually is a better candidate than Urkesh. Like Urkesh, Urfa fulfills all the geographical criteria we've already gone over. It is past Haran, specifically 42 kilometers, therefore placing it within the same country as Haran. It is beyond and across the river Euphrates in the perspective of people dwelling in Canaan. It is located in Aram Naharaim, between the two rivers, and it is within the region of Oli Shem. This makes me wonder if all the cities that are said to be established by Abraham's lineage are within the same immediate region, the Sanli Urfa province. The problem with this is that if Abraham's father intended on moving to Canaan, fully knowing how long of a journey it would be, why would he have called quits after just 40 kilometers of traveling? It seems to me that if he had traveled all the way from Urkesh, 200 kilometers away, that's a reasonable enough distance to make you reconsider going another 400 kilometers to Canaan. Now pair that with the story of Terah and the Taurus Mountains and the etymology of Urkesh, and that is why I still do believe Urkesh is the land of Urkashdim. Now, what would explain the city of Nahor being near Haran in Sanli Urfa other than the possibility that Urkashdim is Urfa? In my opinion, if Terah was King Terah, it makes sense that his father would have expanded his domain and conquered or built cities, then naming them after himself. This was a practice done by rulers of all sorts throughout all ages. If this was the case, it would lend even more insight as to why Terah and Abraham chose to go westwards around the Kabul River towards Haran. It would have been within proximity to the city of their forefather Nahor. Not only may they have been familiar with this region, but this region may have been familiar with them. That said, if Nahor city is nearby Haran, why didn't they just travel to Nahor's town rather than Haran? One explanation is that it's possible that the city of Nahor was on the western side of the Balik River, whereas Haran was on the eastern side. As we went over earlier, it would be a complete hassle to move that amount of humans and livestock across rivers and mountains. It would have been very convenient for Terah and his family to call it quits while in Haran and just settle there. Nonetheless, tradition does say that Nahor is in the same region as Haran and attached to the Balik River. But tradition isn't always correct. So what if there is another candidate for the city of Nahor? In my opinion, the city of Nahor may be the ancient Hurrian city of Nawar, located in the Upper Kabul region near the modern village of Tel Brak. This location is roughly 60 kilometers south of the city Urkesh, and why this is important is because multiple kings of Urkesh also held the title King of Nawar. Now, if Abraham comes from the royal dynasty of Urkesh, and his grandfather Nahor named a city after himself, it makes sense that from there on out, the kings of Urkesh would also claim kingship over Nahor city. Etymologically speaking, Nawar is quite close to Nahor. That said, during the 3rd millennium BC, the city was known as Nagar. This name might have been of Semitic origin and meant a cultivated place. This is interesting because the name Nagar is close to Nakar, and the accurate pronunciation of Nahor is actually Nakor. What I'm getting at is that Nagar is close to Nakar, which is close to Nakor. If you think I'm reaching, consider that KH and G were often interchanged, just like in Mari text 7 verse 12, where Urkesh is translated as Urgish. Essentially, Nagar could easily be translated as Nakar, and this is very close to the proper pronunciation of Nahor, which is Nakor. So Nakor becomes Nakar. Therefore, It is very likely that Nahor, which was ruled over by the kings of Urkesh, is actually the city of Nahor where Isaac's wife Rebekah came from. Now, here's the problem that people might bring up. The Hurrians had a very unique language, and it was neither Semitic or Indo-European, but an isolate related to Urartian. Because of this, people will refuse to accept that a Semite like Abraham did not come from a Semitic-speaking nation. People will claim that the Hurrians did not speak a Semitic dialect because they weren't Semites. However, this is a flawed approach, because all the people in the region near Ararat would have descended from Noah, even the Hurrians, who are claimed to be separate from Hamites, Semites, and Japhetic Aryans. I call this issue the Canaan conundrum, because this misunderstanding stems from the fact that Canaanites have hijacked the paradigm and warped history to fit their agenda. See, East Akkadian is claimed to be the first Semitic language dating back to 2500 BC. As we know, the Akkadians were an offshoot of Amorites, who themselves were an offshoot of Canaan. Prior to the development of East Akkadian, the Phoenicians had also begun to develop their script in around 3000 BC. The Phoenician language and script is also considered to be Semitic. However, the original Phoenicians prior to the conquest of Joshua were Canaanites from the lineage of Ham. So here we see two non-Semitic Canaanite groups forming the basis for later Semitic dialects. And what we can learn from this is that the Semitic languages do not always correlate to the Semitic bloodlines. This language group spread far and wide and was spoken by both Semites and non-Semites. On the other hand, I am sure there are lineages from Shem who did not speak any languages from the Semitic family. Think about the rest of the lineages that come from Shem but do not dwell in Semitic-speaking territories. Just because the Hurrians speak a separate dialogue than the Canaanite Phoenicians or the Akkadians does not mean they were not Semitic. Proof of this is found in chapter 8 of Jubilees. Verse 21 reads, "And he knew that a blessed portion and a blessing had come to Shem and his sons unto the generations forever. The whole land of Eden and the whole land of the Red Sea and the whole land of the East and India, and on the Red Sea and the mountains thereof, and all the land of Bashan, and all the land of Lebanon, and the islands of Kaftur, and all the mountains of Sanir and Amana, and the mountains of Ashur in the north, and all the land of Elam, Asher, and Babel, and Susan and Meadai, and all the mountains of Ararat, and all the region beyond the sea, which is beyond the mountains of Ashur towards the north, a blessed and spacious land, and all that is in it is very good." Here we see that Shem's lineage also dwelled beyond Mesopotamia in countries such as Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and even reaching India. Surely, none of these lineages spoke a Semitic dialect. Regardless, they are still Semites. Now, as I said before, the Hurrian language was related to Urartian dialect. Urartians dwelled around Mount Ararat and claimed descent from the Arameans. Their first king was even named Aryan. That said, the term Aramean had also become synonymous with the Amorites, and there is now substantial evidence that they were heavily intertwined. I guess this is why Ezekiel 16 verse 3 says, "Thy birth and thy nativity is of the land of Canaan. Thy father was an Amorite, and thy mother a Hittite." Though Abraham more than likely had Amorite admixture, this verse is primarily speaking about his culture and upbringing. Considering Abraham may have been the son of Terah, king of Urkesh, the topic of the Amorite Lim dynasty becomes relevant once again. During the early 2nd millennium BC, Urkesh fell into the hands of the rulers of Mari, a city a few hundred miles to the south. The king of Urkesh had then become a vassal for the Mari. The people of Urkesh evidently resented this, as the royal archives at Mari provide evidence of their strong resistance. In one letter, the king of Mari tells his Urkesh counterpart, likely King Terah, "I did not know that the sons of your city hate you on my account, but you are mine, even if the city of Urkesh is not." From this, we can discern that the kings of Urkesh, leading up to Abraham's birth, had gradually been assimilated into the customs and culture of the Amorite Mari. The Amorite Mari spoke a Semitic dialect, and King Terah obviously was able to correspond with them in this language. This makes me wonder if the Mari's influence over the non-Semitic speaking Hurrians is a factor as to why Abraham came to adopt a Semitic dialect and form Hebrew. This also makes me think of whether these Mari had an influence on Abraham in regards to his theology. See, the Mari evidently had an Eden story. Several temples of this period were built over corresponding sanctuaries of pre-Sargonic times. The temples of Ishtar, Ninursag, and the temple of Shamash. A temple of Dagon, also known as the Lion's Temple, was founded by the late 3rd millennium BC. Special elegance was provided in several halls and courts by multicolored frescoes depicting chiefly ritual and mythological scenes. One being an idealized garden, with its trees guarded by cherubim, and being symbolically watered by 4 streams flowing from a single source, all being reminiscent of the biblical Eden. Ultimately, as a royal vassal to the Amorite Lim dynasty, Abraham and Terah would have picked up numerous Amorite customs and even learned their language. Pair that with the fact that a large portion of Urkesh already had Aramean and Amorite roots, and it's quite evident that Abraham was extremely influenced by the Amorites. Therefore, Ezekiel is right in saying his father was an Amorite. So, if we know that Abraham had Amorite admixture and was culturally considered to be an Amorite, we should be able to get a rough idea of how Abraham looked by looking at depictions of ancient Amorites. The best one we have is an ancient Egyptian depiction of 3 Amorite captives, and each of these men have clear Caucasoid features. For example, all show a lack of prognathism, meaning their lips and mouth do not reach beyond the tip of their nose. They also had relatively high nose bridges in comparison to Asians and Africans. These noses align more with the Greek, Roman, or Nordic type. Each of these men have dolichocephalic skulls, which is far more common amongst people of Caucasoid origin. On the other hand, Africans tend to be brachiocephalic and Asians tend to be mesaticephalic. Funnily enough, a few videos back I joked about growing out a peo and put up a side profile shot of myself. So when I came across this depiction of the Amorites, I laughed, because the one in the middle looks pretty similar to my own side profile. Obviously, my head is dolichocephalic and shaped exactly like this Amorite man's. Even further, the Mari are descended from the Amorites, so we should be able to get an idea of how the Amorites looked based on statues of the Mari, and it just so happens that a ton of them have blue eyes. For example, Ebi Il. But, to move on from the appearance of the Amorites and get back to Urkashdim, the Hurrian culture that prevailed over Urkesh seemingly had a massive influence on the Hebrews, therefore corroborating that Abraham came from among the Hurrians. Urkesh and Haran are located within the heart of the Hurrian region, and because of this, the stories of the patriarchs reflect some of the cultural norms in Hurrian society. An article by Dr. Claude Mariattini states, many of the regulations outlined in the Nuzi tablets were also practiced by the patriarchs. Nuzi was a Hurrian city near Kirkuk in Iraq. According to John Bright, numerous incidents in the Genesis narrative have been explained in the light of customs that were current in the 2nd millennium. The Nuzi texts reflect the customary law of predominantly Hurrian population in the Tigris region. Bright goes on by listing several Hurrian practices that were similar to the practices of the patriarchs in the book of Genesis. For one, Abraham's fear in Genesis 15 verse 1-4 that his slave Eliezer would be his heir becomes understandable in the light of slave adoption as practiced in Nuzi. Childless couples would adopt a son who would serve them as long as they lived and inherit upon their death. But, should a natural son be born, the adopted son would have to yield the right of their inheritance. Secondly, As Sarah gave her slave Hagar to Abraham as a concubine, the newsy marriage contract obliged the wife, if childless, to provide her husband with a substitute. Should a son be born of such a union, the expulsion of the slave wife and her child was forbidden. This explains why Abraham was reluctant to send Hagar and Ishmael away in chapter 21, verse 10. In the case of the Laban and Jacob stories, the newsy texts are especially illuminating. The adoption of Jacob by Laban, the condition laid on him to take no other wives than Laban's daughters, the resentment of Leah and Rachel against Laban, and finally Rachel's theft of Laban's gods are all illustrated by Newsian customs. So it's very evident that there were cultural affinities between the Hurrians and the Israelites. There is also a connection between the Genesis creation story and a specific figure from the Hurrian pantheon. This was the goddess Hebat or Hepat. Due to the influence of Hurrian religion, she was also worshipped by Hittites and Luwians. Hebat, also transcribed as Kiba or Kipat, was the mother goddess of the Hurrians, known as the mother of all living. She is also a queen of the gods. But in Aramean times, she appears to have become identified with the goddess Hawa. Eve in Hebrew is Hawa, and according to traditions, she is the mother of all living. Even further, Hebat's best attested role is that of the wife of the weather god, whose identity varied depending on culture and time period. So we see that she was not exactly the goddess of anything, but her primary purpose was to be a wife to the deity and serve him. That's exactly what Eve was to do for Adam. Her primary role and purpose was to be a wife to Adam and serve him. Genesis 2 verse 18, "And the Lord God said, It is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him." So here we see that there is both an etymological and practical correlation between the Hurrian goddess Hepat and Eve. Now, everything I've gone over thus far should be enough evidence to show that the true home of Abraham was in the northern plain of Mesopotamia, and not near the mouth of the Persian Gulf in the south. But why is this important enough to make a video on? What are the implications in regards to everything I talk about on my channel? Evidence indicates that the Israelites were a branch of the Indo-Europeans. So you may be wondering, how do they tie into the picture? Well, the Hurrians were ruled over by an Indo-European elite called the Mitanni, though not much of them is known due to a lack of archaeological finds. Unfortunately, much of the information circulating about them is based on the minimal amounts of evidence we have of their existence. Nonetheless, this is what we know of them. The Mitanni kingdom was multi-ethnic and contained both East and West Semitic populations. The most prevalent ethnic group within the Mitanni kingdom were the Hurrians. At the top of the hierarchy were an Indo-European warrior elite called the Marianu, a caste of chariot-mounted, hereditary warrior nobility. The name Marianu, although plural, takes on the singular Maria, which in Sanskrit means young warrior. These young warriors are reminiscent of the Indo-European Koryos, who form bands of warriors in which unmarried young males serve for several years as a rite of passage into manhood. Scholars have argued that the institution of the Koryos played a key role in the Indo-European migrations and the diffusion of their languages across Eurasia. Raids headed by these young warrior nobles could have led to the establishment of new settlements on foreign lands, preparing the ground for the larger migration of whole tribes including old men, women, and children. What it seems like is that the Marianu charioteers stem from a branch of the Koryos, who upon arriving in the Hurrian ledge intermarried with surrounding tribes and made relationships that would catapult them to power within the region. This would explain why they chose to settle and plant roots in this region. That said, it could also be that the Mitanni in entirety were a tribe of the Indo-Europeans migrating to find a new home, and that upon settling in the Hurrian ledge, they carried out the ancestral practice of sending out young warbands to conquer new lands. Nonetheless, we see that the Hurrians were ruled over by a young Aryan warrior elite. Now, the Mitanni Empire was a strong regional power limited by the Hittites to the north, Egyptians to the west, Kassites to the south, and later by the Assyrians to the east. At its maximum extent, their domain of influence stretched as far west as Kizuwatna by the Taurus Mountains, Tunip in the south, Arapi to the east, and to the north Lake Van. They even ruled over Urkesh. Their impact is attested to by Hurrian place names, personal names, and the spread of a distinct pottery type called Nuziware throughout Syria and the Levant. In the south, the Mitanni kingdom extended from Aleppo across to Mari, and then to the east. The entire region was fertile and allowed for agriculture without artificial irrigation. Herds of cattle, sheep, horses, and goats were raised, and the Mitanni were famed horsemen and charioteers, even credited for writing the first ever horse training manual in history. Well, in Genesis 46 verse 31 to 34, Joseph says to his brothers and his father's household, "I will go up and speak to the Pharaoh and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who were living in the land of Canaan have come to me. The men are shepherds, they tend livestock, and they have brought along their flocks and herds and everything they own. When Pharaoh calls you in to ask, 'What is your occupation?' you should answer, 'Your servants had tended livestock from our boyhood on, just as our fathers did.'" So the Israelites and their forefathers had always been shepherds and tended to livestock. And this was an integral trait of the Mitanni. Even further, it was an integral trait of Indo-Europeans in general, as they were the first to domesticate cattle and diffuse this practice as nomadic shepherd kings. It is even due to the Indo-Europeans that the horse has, one, spread far and wide even to the Americas, and two, evolved in such a way, therefore producing hundreds of breeds. So, when Joseph's brothers tell Pharaoh that their forefathers had always been shepherds, tending livestock, they're speaking of their Indo-European ancestors, and their traditions that stretched back millennium. Now, of course, a lot of my content is focused around the R1b haplogroup, as I speculate they are the lineage of Isaac, while R1a is Ishmael and R2 are the sons of Keturah. Well, the migration of R1b people can be followed archaeologically through the presence of domesticated cattle. It has been hypothesized that R1b people, perhaps alongside neighboring J2 tribes, were the first to domesticate cattle in northern Mesopotamia, some 10,500 years ago. The increased involvement of humans in the life of these cattle led to their progressive taming. Cattle herders probably maintained a nomadic or semi-nomadic existence, while other people in the Fertile Crescent, such as haplogroups E1b, G, and T, settled down to cultivate the lands or keep smaller domesticates. Quickly regarding J2, we see them pop up everywhere, and one reason for this is that they are the sons of Canaan. Obviously, Canaan was to be a servant to both Japheth and Shem, so everywhere these lineages would go, there would also be a trace of J2. If you want more information on J2 and how they are Canaanite, refer back to my video on Haplogroup R, the Abrahamic haplogroup. And now back to the video, here's where things get interesting. Though the Mitanni Aryan elite had gradually integrated into the Hurrian people, coming to speak their language, adopting cultural norms, and taking Hurrian wives, these Mitanni are currently the oldest documented attestation for Sanskrit in the entire world. This indicates that Sanskrit was originally spoken by the Mitanni, who then brought it to the sub-Asian continent. This explains why the term Marianu is connected to the Sanskrit Maria, meaning young warrior. It was a distinguishing trait of the Mitanni elite to bear Sanskrit names. Though we know very little about the Mitanni Empire, we do have the names of 18 kings that ruled over this kingdom. Keep in mind that the first in the list is by no means the first Mitanni ruler, but rather the first documented evidence for a Mitanni ruler. So they almost certainly stretch back further than the records we have. Nonetheless, the first recorded king was named Maeta, who was succeeded by Kirta, and then Shutarna I, and then Paratarna I, and then Parshatatar, and then Shaushtatar, and then Paratarna II, and then Shaitarna, and then Artatama I, and then Shutarna II, and then Artashumera, and then Tushrata, and then Artatama II, and then Shutarna III, and then Shatiwaza, and then Shatuara, and then Wasashata, and lastly Shatuara II. Other names common amongst the Mitanni elite were names such as Purusa, meaning man, Tusrata, meaning having an attacking chariot, Suvardata, meaning given by the heavens, Indrata, meaning helped by Indra, and Subandhu, a name that exists till this day in India. The Mitanni also worshipped the same gods as those in the Rig Veda, though they also had their own local ones. These Mitanni gods were also the most important gods in the Rig Veda. Now keep in mind, I have speculated in the past that R1a is the lineage of Ishmael, while R1b is Isaac. Well, the Mitanni were predominantly R1a, so one of two things are possible. Either the Mitanni are Ishmaelites, possibly the sons of Midian, or Abraham comes from an R1a tribe and then passes this chromosome onto Ishmael with a mutation arising in Isaac, thus making him R1b. Either way, I am almost certain that the Mitanni are connected to Abraham in one way or another, and here is why. In my video on the R haplogroup, I bring up how Hinduism was likely created by the sons of Ishmael and Keturah, and there are numerous points corroborating this speculation. Firstly, based on all the evidence I've gone over since starting my channel, R1b is the most likely candidate for identifying the sons of Isaac. This is important because Abraham had 3 sets of sons with different women. The first son was Ishmael, and his mother was Hagar. The second son was Isaac, and his mother was Sarah. The third set of sons were Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua, and their mother was Keturah. So, if R1b is the second clade of R and correlates to the traits and prophecies of Abraham's second set of offspring through Isaac, and the youngest clade of R, which is R2, correlates to the traits and prophecies of Abraham's youngest set of sons through Keturah, then the oldest clade of R, which is R1a, who correlate to the traits and prophecies of Abraham's oldest set of sons, would be Ishmael. They obviously fit the chronological order. Now, in Genesis 25 verse 6, the sons of Abraham's concubines are sent eastwards. So they would have likely ended up traveling into Mesopotamia and then through Iran into India. When we account for the fact that the sons of Abraham were blessed, that they would possess the gates of their enemies, and that they create nations of their own, we can conclude that they were dominant throughout their migrations and would come to rule over foreign demographics. So, which ancient nobility from the East best fits this description? Well, there is now substantial evidence that the Aryan invasion of ancient India was a 100% literal event, considered to have started after 2000 BC and slowly diffusing for the next 3 centuries. Right here, we see that the period of this migration aligns perfectly with the timeline of Abraham and the birth of Ishmael. This migration led to a language shift in the Indian subcontinent, and massive societal changes like the introduction of a caste system. The higher castes were comprised of priests, kings, and warriors, while the lower castes comprised of workers and peasants. Obviously, these castes are hereditary, so the ethnic makeup of each caste tells us a lot about the origins of these people groups. Why this is relevant is because higher castes are synonymous with lighter skin, eye, and hair tones. Essentially, they descend from the Indo-Aryan elite who rode in on horseback and colonized South Asia. At the head of the hierarchy was the Brahmin caste, who functioned as the spiritual and intellectual leaders of society. They devoted their time to studying, teaching, performing sacrifices, and officiating religious services. And here's the kicker. Modern Brahmins are over 70% R1a on their Y DNA chromosome. So if the Mitanni are R1a and R1a is Ishmael, it perfectly explains why Hinduism has such a connection to Abraham. To start, the Brahmins get their name from Brahma, the creator god in Hinduism. When we compare the names Abraham and Brahma, we see a massive connection in the etymology. Brahma is just Abraham minus the A and with the last two letters interchanged. Not to mention, Hindu texts tell that all the life on earth came from Brahma, and this is a slight parallel to the fact that all the life on earth is blessed through Abraham. Even further, Brahma has 4 heads, which parallel Abraham's seed dispersing in all 4 directions, as well as Abraham's descendants forming the world's 4 main religions: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and now Hinduism. It even parallels how Abraham's seed becomes 4 primary groups: Ishmaelites, Edomites, Israelites, and the children of Keturah. This is because Esau and Jacob were said to be 2 separate nations. Now pair all of this with the fact that Brahma's wife is named Sarasvati and that Abraham's wife was named Sarah, we can even further support my claim. There's even a mention in the Vedas of a war between 10 kings, something spoken of in Genesis 14 of the Bible when Abraham goes to war with 9 other kings. So, considering the fact that Brahmins are 70% R1a and that R1a was earlier carried by an Indo-Aryan elite called the Mitanni, and that the Mitanni are the earliest evidence for Sanskrit on earth, and that the Mitanni had young nomadic warrior bands who rode on chariots, it becomes very clear that the Aryan invaders of India who rode in on horseback and chariot, then introducing Sanskrit and writing the Vedas, were predominantly sons of Ishmael moving eastwards to conquer new lands. It's possible that throughout time, their story was twisted and warped into a religion, with figures like Abraham and Sarah being deified. It's also possible that the Ishmaelites twisted this story themselves and deified their ancestors in veneration, thus making themselves demigods to a foreign land. This would have helped them establish rulership in the region, therefore solidifying their position at the top of the hierarchy. Either way, we see a connection in etymology, names, language, historical events, religion, and genetics. There's even a cultural affinity because one item that binds the Abrahamic religions to Hinduism is the turban. In India, only the royal entourage and high officials were permitted to wear turbans before the founding of the Mughal Empire in the 16th century. The garment was a symbol of status, and was often decorated with peacock plumes and ornaments. Hinduism, with its strict caste system, forbade individuals of lower castes from donning turbans. Now, though turbans have become synonymous with India, they actually originate in Mesopotamia. And this is yet another reason as to why the Mesopotamian origin for these Aryan invaders is most likely. Even further, it's more evidence that these Aryans were from the seed of Abraham, since it's the Abrahamic religions in particular who don this head wrap. In the Bible, we see that all the high priests in Israel wore turbans called mitznefets. Through all of this, it becomes evident that the Aryan invasion is a fact, and that these colonists were actually the sons of Abraham, predominantly through Ishmael, but also through Isaac and Keturah's sons. See, R1b is also present in India, as is R2. It seems that a minority of these invaders may have actually been from these 2 bloodlines as well. And now, since I've gone over R1b in all my other videos, I don't feel the need to go into them, but let's quickly recap why I believe R2 is Keturah. You have the chronological order of R matching Abraham's sons, you have the fact that the sons of Abraham's concubines are sent eastwards and that R2 is almost entirely in India, but you also have the name Keturah, which means incense. Well, which nation east of Mesopotamia is known for their use of incense? That would be India, where the R2 haplogroup is situated. And why is it that India is the world's largest incense producer, responsible for 70% of the world's incense use. Well, that would be Hinduism, which we have already shown to have deities like Brahma and Sarasvati, a subversion of Abraham and Sarah. Therefore, we have a correlation between the youngest branch of Abraham's sons through Keturah, who is named after incense, and the youngest clade of RY DNA situated in a land known for its incense. Now, keep in mind that Abraham's oldest and youngest branches were pagan and turned to idol worship, while his middle branch stuck to Torah and came to accept Christ. Why is it that R1A and R2 nations are still entrenched in paganism and idol worship till this day, while Western nations of R1B descent have always accepted Christ? Well, it's due to their ancestral roots, which are explained in the Bible. Now, a quick mention before we move on is that the fact Abraham sent his concubine sons eastwards to colonize new lands again shows that he was an Indo-European. This practice correlates to the Corios and the Marianu and every other warrior band descended from Indo-Europeans, especially in the Vedic traditions of India. So Abraham taking part in this tradition speaks volumes. Now, what ultimately happened is that the Aryan nobility rode out of Mesopotamia through Iran and into India, where they would come to dominate the native population and rule over them. Even more importantly, this debunks the notion that the Mitanni came into Mesopotamia from India after the development of Sanskrit back in the East. This speculation is rooted in the assumption that the Mitanni inherited their names from India, rather than India inheriting the way of life of the Mitanni. This has led people to seek an Eastern origin for the Mitanni, but I think it's a bit more complicated than that. In my opinion, they are not from Iran. They are Ishmaelites from Mesopotamia, and here's a bit more evidence of their Middle Eastern origins. Mitanni wasn't their only name. They were also called Habigalbat in Babylonian texts, Hani-Galbat in Assyrian records, and Hani-Rabat in Semitic scriptures. Linguists are mostly in agreement that these terms translate to Great Hana, and this is in reference to the kingdom of Hana. This Hurrian kingdom is located in the middle Euphrates region, with its capital Terah located 45 kilometers north of Mari. They inhabited land on territories formerly ruled by the sovereigns of Mari. The rulers of Mari held the title King of Mari, Tutal, and the land of Hana. Since Mari was abandoned after its destruction by Hammurabi in 1759, and Tutal certainly was not part of the territories of the new state, the location of Hana is identified within the territories around Mari. Prior to their fall, the people of Hana led a semi-nomadic life characterized by seasonal movements of the sheep herds, and then returning to their settlements for the harvest season. Based on onomastic evidence, the Hana were related to other West Semitic groups such as the Amorites, Benjaminites, Rabians, and the Habiru. So the Hana also fulfill the criteria of having been shepherds and tenders of flocks, which Joseph claimed was a trait of his forefathers. They also relate to the Amorites, which would explain why Ezekiel said Abraham was an Amorite. Furthermore, their kingdom at one point was under dominion of the Amorite Mari kings, so this would even further show an Amorite influence. But, most interestingly, the Hana are also said to be related to the Habiru, which many people connect to the biblical Hebrews. And on that note, an interesting bit of information is that Hittite records show that the dominant ethnic group represented in the Habirus who served as mercenaries to the Hittite king were the Hurrians with a small Semitic contingent. Now, mentions of the Hana range from the end of the 18th century to the middle of the 17th century BC. This is over 1 century before the first mentions of the Mitanni. Yet, the Mitanni are called Great Hana. So it seems that the Mitanni stem from Hana, and that they ended up adopting an eponymous name, most likely from King Maeta, thus becoming the Mitanni. This would show that the Mitanni have even deeper roots in the Middle East, and that just because they are deemed Indo-European does not mean they can't be Semitic. Think about the Amorites and Hittites, who are Canaanite in origin yet display Indo-European physical traits, cultural norms, and even language in the case of the Hittites. Matter of fact, Hittite is the oldest Indo-European language in the world, older than Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit. As an Indo-European language, Hittite is related to modern-day languages like English. For example, the Hittite word for water is water. Now, why is this all relevant? If Hani Galbat and Hani Rabat mean Great Hana, what does Hana mean? There just may be an answer for that. See, Wikipedia states, execration texts are ancient Egyptian hieratic texts, listing enemies of the pharaoh, enemies of the Egyptian state, or troublesome foreign neighbors. These texts were often found written upon statuettes of bound foreigners, bowls, or blocks of clay or stone, and they were subsequently destroyed. The ceremonial process of breaking the names and burying them was intended to be a sort of sympathetic magic that would affect the person or entities named in the texts. This practice was most common during times of conflict with the Asiatic neighbors of Egypt. Now, the reason I bring this up is because a 19th century execration text from Saqqara has been found with the name Aburahana. Aburahana is quite close to Abraham, but most notably, notice that it's two parts, Abura and Hana. So if Abraham's name truly was something closer to Aburahana, could the kingdom of Hana be referring to Aburahana and his descendants? I believe it's possible, especially considering that the name Aburahana is documented in a text concerning Asiatics at the exact same time Abraham was alive in the Asia Minor. This would substantiate my theory that the Mitanni come from the Hana, which is why they're called the Grey Hana. But this begs the question of whether R1a is Ishmael or if Abraham was also R1a. To break it down, there are a few possibilities. One is that Abraham himself was a Mitanni or Proto-Mitanni prince from the city of Urkesh, and that his entire tribe was of R1a origin. In this case, both Abraham and Ishmael are R1a, with a mutation arising in Isaac, thus making Esau and Jacob R1b. Possibility number two is that Abraham was a Hurrian or Aryan prince from the city of Urkesh, prior to the Ishmaelites forming and taking over the city, then becoming known as the Mitanni. In this case, Abraham can be R1, with his sons from Ishmael forming into R1a and Isaac forming into R1b. Now, to entertain possibility 1, R1a does fit Ishmael perfectly. For one, they're extremely fruitful and exceedingly numerous, which was a blessing to Ishmael in Genesis 17 verse 20. 2, they are in the east, not only on a global scale, but even in terms of the Eastern Hemisphere. 3, they become a great nation, which you could argue is India or even Russia. And this leads into number 4. Ishmael would be wild, untamed, and extremely hostile. Russia in a nutshell. And when we look at Russia, studies suggest that R1a comprises about 53% of their population. So it's certainly a plausible case for Ishmael as R1a. Now, whereas R1a is more centered in Eastern demographics such as Russians, R1b is predominant in Western Europe. One thing I like to bring up is that Russia is now calling all English-speaking Western nations by the name Saxons. This is important because in Genesis 21 verse 12, Abraham is told that in Isaac your seed shall be called. You can argue that this solely means they're being called to worship Yahweh, but it could also mean that his seed is literally called the sons of Isaac. Essentially, Isaac's sons become Sax's sons, which then become Saxons. So it would make sense that the same people being called Saxons in the modern era are the lineage of Isaac. And what do you know? It's R1b nations that are being called this. not by anybody, but by the world's most powerful R1A nation. So R1A isn't Isaac, but R1B is. This is a display of Ishmael's hostility towards his brother. And so, is there a trace of R1B amongst the Arameans, Urartians, and Hurrians? The answer is yes. First of all, these populations are all related and descended from a common source. What happened is Aram becomes the Arameans, who then branch off into the Urartians and Hurrians. While the Hurrians later split and fragment into multiple surrounding nations, the Urartians become known as Armenians over time. So we should look into the Armenians in order to get a better perspective as to which haplogroup the Hurrians and Urartians may have been. Studies show that though the Armenian people are mixed in terms of Y-DNA, they are predominantly R1b. In the Ararat Valley, they even reach up to 37.3%, while other major haplogroups such as T, R1a, L, J1, I2, G1, G2A, and E1b all fall below 10%. The only other haplotype above 10% is J2, which we have already explained is Canaanite, and it is present because Canaan shall serve Japheth and Shem. Remember, Deuteronomy 26 verse 5 says, "My father was a wandering Aramean." It does not say a wandering Chaldean. It does not say a wandering Sumerian. And it does not say a wandering Canaanite. It says a wandering Aramean. Not to say Aram was R1b, but more so that the lineage of Isaac reconnect with their forefathers' land and people later on. Now, I also want to bring up a study titled A Glimpse at the Intricate Mosaic of Ethnicities from Mesopotamia, Paternal Lineages of the Northern Iraqi, Arabs, Kurds, Syriacs, Turkmens, and Yazidis. This article says, while the most prevalent four lineages observed in the combined dataset were J1 at 17.98%, R1b at 12.81%, R1a at 12.40%, and J2A1b at 12.19%, the distributions among the five ethnic groups were found to vary significantly. 14 different haplogroups were observed in the Arabs, with the three most common being J1, R1a, and T. 15 different haplogroups were observed in the Kurds, with the three most common being J2A1b, J1 and R1a, and E1B1b. 10 different haplogroups were observed in the Turkmens, with the three most common being E1B1b, J1, J2A1b, R1a, and G2A. And 11 different haplogroups were observed in the Yazidis, with the three most common being R1b, L, and G2A. So here we see two things. One is that the Syrians are predominantly R1b, and this is important because Urkesh is located in present-day Syria, with Haran being located 20 kilometers from the Syria-Turkey border. Number two is that the Yazidis are predominantly R1b at 20.79%. And this is important because they're native to the exact same region that the Mitanni had once dwelled. The Yazidi are a people who have been absolutely decimated through plots of genocide, and they are living in exile due to threats such as ISIS. This has led to headlines such as ISIS wants to impregnate Yazidi women and smash our blonde bloodline. Fears grow for the 300 women kidnapped in Sinjar. This article goes on to outline how ISIS has been seeking light-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Yazidi women to impregnate and convert to Islam. These Yazidi seem to have maintained their original genetic makeup, so it's possible that they resemble how the Mitanni Aryans originally looked. The Yazidi are also a major factor indicating that R1b has Mesopotamian roots. But there is one more factor that proves this as well. This is King Tutankhamun, whose Y-DNA haplogroup was R1b. This means that his father Akhenaten was also R1b, and that they share DNA with up to 70% of European men. Now, why do I bring up Akhenaten? Well, we have gone over alternative names for the Mitanni, such as Hanigalbat and Haniurabat, but I haven't mentioned what the Egyptians called them. The Amarna letters show that during the 18th dynasty of Egypt, Egyptians referred to the Mitanni as Naharin. This term seems to be derived from the Assyro-Akkadian word for river. Obviously, this term is related to Naharem, which in Hebrew referred to the land between the two rivers, Mesopotamia. In the Bible, Aram's name was added before it because this is the land he was allotted in the Book of Jubilees. Essentially, the Egyptians identified them by saying they were the people between the rivers in Mesopotamia. That said, I want to suggest that this term Naharin may also connect to Nahor, father of Terah and grandfather of Abraham. To refer back to Genesis, we know that Nahor has his own city, and that he is the progenitor of Abraham's family. If Teru of Urkesh is Terah, it makes sense that Nahor was also a king of Urkesh. And in this case, doesn't it make sense for the Mitanni to be called after their forefather who ruled over the exact same lands they reconquered? I personally think it does. They are Nahor's seed dwelling in Nahor's land. That said, there is no evidence whatsoever that Naharin refers to Nahor's lineage. And it's a bit of a stretch considering Naharin matches the Akkadian word Naharem, meaning between the two rivers. I only consider this scenario because there are many instances of people being named after their monarchs or patriarchs throughout history. A prime example was the Israelites when they were conquered by Assyria, because the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III refers to the northern house of Israel as Bit Kumri, or in English, the House of Omri. Omri was an Israelite king. Nevertheless, the Mitanni and Egypt have a deep connection with one another. During the reigns of Thutmose I, Thutmose III, and Amenhotep II, Egypt was in conflict with the kingdom of Mitanni for control of the Levant. Amenhotep II's son, Thutmose IV, would eventually make peace with the Mitanni. Henceforth, relationships between Egypt and the Naharin were peaceful, with much diplomacy and even royal intermarriage.
Nefertiti, the great queen of Egypt, enchanting in her beauty, a beckoning, mysterious gaze, which captivated even time itself. Each of us, at least once in their lifetime, saw the famous bust and heard the name of Nefertiti, but very few people know that the queen, whose life was comprised of countless legends, came from a northern country, which we now call Mitanni. In ancient times, it was a large state, antagonized by Egypt and the Hittites, and occupying most of the Near East. This state, inhabited by various tribes and nationalities, created an interesting center of civilization. However, the main and most influential Mitanni ethnos were the Hurrics. Today, there remains no unified opinion of scientists in regard to this origin. However, it is known that the Hurrites were related to Urartis and belonged to what is termed the Armenoid race. According to the commonly accepted scientific version, the Mitanni originated from the territory of northern Mesopotamia, not far from the sacred mountain of Ararat. The language used in the state of Mitanni to this day contains abundant mysteries and has not been thoroughly studied. However, according to the available information, scientists conclude that the language of the Hurrians and Armenians has a direct relation. After all, Mitanni and the Egyptians, on the basis of these studies, called the Hurrites Hara or Hera. Urartu, or the Ararat kingdom, that inherited them were in the same territory where the Armenian people had historically lived. That is why, already in the 5th century BC, the Greek author Xenophon called this vast territory, in precise terms, the Armenian Mountains. Given the features of the ancient Semitic and cuneiform writings, we have only consonant sounds, and one inserts the vowels by their own sonorousness and corresponding relevance, based on the most convenient pronunciation. The Egyptians, on the basis of this, called the Hurrites Hara. It is noteworthy that Armenians from time immemorial call themselves Hay, and in the plural Hayer. The Hurrian state called the Egyptians Naharina, which in translation means the country of rivers. It is noteworthy that their neighbors, the Assyrians, called Urartu Nahiri, which is also translated as a country of rivers. The Hurrite kings called themselves Hayer, and the country of Mitanni or Mituni. It is known that Mitanni was a multinational statehood, united by the Hurri majority. Therefore, there is an assumption that Mitanni can mean one house or one country. In Armenian, Mitun also means one house or one country. In no other existent language is it possible to find similar coincidences with the Hurrian language. Small Hurrian kingdoms began to appear at the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC. The most powerful of them was the state of Mitanni, which reached its peak in the 15th and 14th centuries BC, when a series of wars began with another powerful state of its time, Egypt. An Egyptian chronicle, discovered in 1887, tells about the mutual relations of both countries in sufficient detail. The rulers of the two countries came to understand the mutual benefit of peaceful coexistence and the meaninglessness of permanent conflict. Thutmose IV and Artatam I concluded a treaty of peace and friendship, and to consolidate the treaty they organized a dynastic marriage between Pharaoh Thutmose IV and the Mitanni princess Mutimui. So the daughter of the Mitanite ruler became the queen of Egypt and the mother of the next Egyptian pharaoh, Amenhotep III. Thutmose IV also married one of the country's queens to a Mitanni. Up to 10 years of his reign, circa 1445 BC, Amenhotep III sent diplomats on a matchmaking mission to the king of Mitanni, Tushrat, asking for the hand of his daughter, Taduhepi. The princess accepted enthusiastically and with royal honors. The Egyptians were captivated by the beauty of the foreign princess and named her Nefertiti, which in Egyptian means the beauty has come, or the coming of beauty. The queen's beauty captivates even today when we see this beautiful bust, the delicate features, the long neck, and the expressive eyes. Upon becoming queen, Nefertiti, however, soon lost her husband, Amenhotep III. On the throne came his young son, Amenhotep IV. The new king was in love with the beautiful Nefertiti, and gaining the blessing of the king of Mitanni, married Nefertiti, making her his eldest wife. Pharaoh Amenhotep IV took a new name, Akhenaten, and started large-scale religious conversions that radically changed the age-old customs of Egypt. These reforms led to sharp clashes between the elite and the pharaoh. The new pharaoh acknowledged the single sun god Aten, instead of hundreds of gods who since ancient times had been traditionally worshipped by the Egyptians. Akhenaten and Nefertiti devoted all their life to preaching this new religion. The new capital, Akhetaton, was founded, and on the walls of the temples of Aten appeared fine portraits of his beloved wife. A large portion of Akhenaten's writings were also devoted to Nefertiti. In them, he praises her beauty, her charm, and calls her perfect. However, the pharaoh shows no interest in either internal nor external politics. The relationship with the nobility of Egypt and its neighboring states was spoiled. According to some data, Akhenaten was slain in disgruntlement. Soon after his death, at the age of 37 years old, Nefertiti died. After this, for a short period, the son of Akhenaten, born from his sister with the name of Tutankhamun, came to reign. This is the same Tutankhamun who later became the symbol of Egypt. Interestingly, the genetic DNA tests of Tutankhamun and Akhenaten confirm the presence of haplogroups R1, which is characteristic for the inhabitants of Southwest Asia, more specifically, modern Armenians, Ossetians, and some other peoples. In fact, several generations of royal families continued the kinship between Mitanni and Egypt, where Hurrite queens ruled. It is curious that the most interesting periods of Egyptian history included the period of Queen Nefertiti And largely, through her public figure, humanity has come to learn about the most interesting events of that dynasty. Mitanni civilization has had a profound impact on the culture of the neighboring peoples of Syria, Babylon, the Hittite Empire, and, of course, Egypt. However, the withdrawal of Mitanni from the historical arena at the end of the second millennium initiated the formation of a new state, the Kingdom of Ararat or Urartu, which became the successor of this great culture, and which once again took the position of one of the most authoritative powers of Asia.
So let's break this down. The Mitanni are primarily R1a, whereas the 18th dynasty of Egypt is R1b. The 18th dynasty get their R1by DNA from the Hyksos, who were comprised of Hittites, Amorites, and Mitanni. Matter of fact, the Hyksos rode into Egypt on chariots, thus introducing this method of transportation to the African continent. And what does that sound like? The Marianu charioteers, who formed the Mitanni Empire around the exact same time as the Hyksos invaded Egypt. Akhenaten, the most mysterious pharaoh in Egyptian history, dramatically transformed both the political and artistic landscape of Egypt during his reign. Besides the introduction of the world's first monotheistic religion in history, another notable change was the common depiction of the pharaoh with his family, which hitherto was unheard of. This artistic motif may very well have been adopted by Akhenaten from his Mitanni mother and wife, Tia and Nefertiti. This is because the family gathering that is so unique to Akhenaten is seen on multiple Mitanni seals from the kings of Urkesh. Compare the depiction of Akhenaten with his family and the kings of Urkesh with theirs, and they are extremely similar. Now, if Tia and Nefertiti are both Mitanni, they should carry traces of Indo-European descent. And that's exactly what we see in the both of them. Firstly, Nefertiti's bust depicts her with numerous Caucasoid features, but unfortunately we do not have her haplotype. When it comes to Tia, people will often claim that she was black, because they draw their conclusions off the unpainted, darkened yew wood bust of her. Yew wood naturally darkens over time, especially thousands of years. But fresh yew is actually a tan color similar to Caucasian skin. People will also mistake the blue snakeskin headdress as an afro and completely overlook the faint blue residue on her head, or the fact that there was an extension to this crown that was conveniently removed from most pictures, thus making it look even more like an afro. None of these Afrocentric propagandists actually look at her mummy, which has natural wavy red hair, a high nose bridge, a thin nose, a lack of prognathism, and moderately thin lips. They also don't look at her parents' mummies, such as Yuya, who carried haplogroup G2A, Iranian in origin, or her mother Tuyu, who carried haplogroup K. What's significant about the mitochondrial haplogroup K is that it is Indo-European in origin, and is the sister lineage of R1a and R1b. This means that the R1a Mitanni likely had K wives. And this would explain how these acclaimed Mitanni women in Egypt, such as Nefertiti and Tia, are of the mitochondrial haplogroup K. Now, in 2014, Fernandez et al. Tested the remains of 15 individuals from the pre-pottery Neolithic site of Tel Halula and Tel Ramad in Syria, and identified 6 members of haplogroup K. In 2016, Lazaridis et al. Tested Neolithic farmers from Jordan and Western Iran, while in 2016, Kalinch et al. Analyzed genomes from Neolithic Central Anatolia. Both of them found numerous K1a samples, belonging notably to the subclades K1a4b and K1a12a. Ashkenazi Jews are the ethnic group with the highest percentage of K lineages today, with about 32% in average and up to 50% among Ashkenazi Jews from Germany. There are only 3 typically Jewish subclades of K: K1a1b1a, K1a9, and K2A2A. There are other subclades like K1A7, K1A8, and K2C, which are also found amongst people of Jewish descent, but they are very rare. K1A is also very common in the Levant today, most notably amongst the Druze, who are believed to be the population most representative of the pre-Arabic expansions into the Levant and possibly the closest to the original Neolithic farmers. So, considering all of this, it should be clear that TA was Caucasoid in origin, and if Nefertiti was from Mitanni, she would likely have similar genetics. But the ultimate point in bringing up the connection between Egypt and the Mitanni is this. If the Mitanni and the 18th dynasty were forming strategic alliances and intermarrying, this may be because they came to an awareness of their common ancestral roots. It's essentially the line of Israel taking wives from their father's house, like both Jacob and Isaac were instructed to. And yes, I do believe Akhenaten is an Israelite, though I have not yet come to a conclusion as to who he actually was. We all know that he is considered to be the true historical basis for the story of Moses, and there are definitely correlations. For example, one that ties into what I was just saying is that Moses took a wife from the house of Midian, and Midian was the son of Ishmael. Well, where was Akhenaten's wife from? The Mitanni, who I speculate are likely Ishmaelites, with their name sounding quite similar to Midian. So here's yet another coincidence or synchronicity that shows that the Mitanni are Ishmaelites. And when paired with the fact that Ishmael's mother Hagar was also an Egyptian, it becomes evident that there is a theme of Egypt and Ishmael being intertwined. Matter of fact, when Joseph was sold into slavery, he was bought by Ishmaelites from Midian. They were en route to Egypt as a caravan, which ultimately indicates that there was an extensive trade between the Egyptians and the Ishmaelites. With that said, the relation between Egypt and the Huria region stretches back even further than the campaign of Thutmose I. This is because Egyptians have an extensive presence in the Asia Minor, meaning Hurrian cities may well have been Egyptianized to a certain extent. This Egyptian influence would perfectly explain why in the Book of Abraham, Ur-Kasdim is said to have an extreme Egyptian influence. Obviously, Ur and Samaria cannot say the same, as the Egyptians had not even come close to it. But Urkesh can. So, to recap and begin closing out this video. At the very least, we should be able to agree that Ur and Sumeria does not fulfill the geographical, cultural, or genetic criteria laid out in scripture. A far better candidate would be Urkesh, though I wouldn't yet rule out Urfa in Turkey. Now, I already see people claiming that I am saying Urkesh is the site of Ur-Kasdim because it was ruled by Indo-European Aryans. But this is false because another possibility for the true identity of Chaldeans is the Kassite dynasty of Babylon. See, Kasdim may be referred to the Assyrian Kashdu, and in my opinion, the Kashdu are likely the Kassites. These people were also of Indo-European descent, and possibly even branched from the Mitanni, or at least from the parent source of the Mitanni. It has been suggested that they even had an Indo-European elite similar to the Mitanni. Their kings appear to have been members of a small military aristocracy, but were apparently efficient rulers and not locally unpopular. The horse, a sacred animal of the Kassites, probably first came into use in Babylonia at this time. The language used by both Mitanni and Kassites seems to be closer to Sanskrit than anything else. Both groups also worship Vedic deities, and like the Mitanni, the Kassites were experts with the horse. Now, most interestingly, there's even some evidence about a link between the kingdom of Hana and the Kassites who came to dominate Babylon in the following centuries after Hana's collapse. From the preserved list of rulers of Hana, the name of one king, Kashtiliash, notably suggests a Kassite origin. There's also a Kassite element in the name of a canal that was dug by one of the other rulers. So it's quite evident that the Mitanni and Kassites were related. and from the same source. My whole point is, if this was about me claiming Abraham was an Aryan, I could have easily brought up that the Kassites were Indo-Europeans, and how all these ancient Sumerian statuettes depict royal and aristocratic figures with white skin and blue eyes. I could bring up that the term Kassites is related to Kasdu, and that they ruled over Ur in the exact same time period that the Exodus occurred. But I did not do that, because I am adamant that Ur in Samaria does not fulfill the criteria presented in scripture, so it cannot be Ur-Kasdim. Even further, ancient Chaldeans seem to have migrated into Mesopotamia sometime between 940 to 860 BC, whereas the Kassites formed around 1531 BC, a time period contemporary with the Exodus. So, the Chaldeans are not contemporary with Abraham, but the Kassites are. And remember, the original scripture never said Chaldeans. It said Kasdim. The translation to Chaldeans is based on assumptions by early scribes who used the landscape of their age to paint a picture of the past. But the term Kasdim was in the original source, and therefore represented something other than the Chaldeans we know of. Now that is all for this video. I always love hearing your feedback and being given additional points that I wasn't aware of, so I do look forward to seeing the comments.